All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. As always, I am absolutely thrilled that you are here. If you've never checked us out before, we are primarily an interview and a commentary-based podcast. Today, I have an interview on the line is JF Monroe. JF, it's so great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't know about an honor, but it's cool. uh, what does the JF stand for?
So it's actually JF Monroe is a pen name that I use when I write, and it pays homage to. I used to write blogs under a pen name that I just took the two initials from it, and
Oh, okay.
so it's just kind of like honor that when I used to write blogs and things like that of that nature.
Oh, well, that's awesome, though. Let me tell you a little bit about J.F. Monroe. She is a very passionate advocate for the magic of storytelling. Her philosophy centers around the belief that the most powerful tales arise from the complexities of human relationships. Each character she creates is not only extraordinary in their abilities, but also relatable in their struggles, growth, and capacity for love and sacrifice. As a fantasy genre, let me ask you this because I hear that term all the time. What does that mean when we know fantasy? What does that genre encompass? Is it's not like Star Wars. That's more science fiction. Is it like what do you? I'll let you tell me what exactly is that genre about?
Sure. So this is a great question, and the way that I always answer it is that and it's going to sound a little bleak, but stick with me, it works. So when you think about fantasy and sci-fi, so when I was first deciding to publish the book, I actually wasn't sure which genre I fell into. And so the way that it was described to me, and I will never forget it, is that sci-fi is based more in like science. So when you think about aliens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do we think that aliens exist out there? Some do, some don't. However, it is plausible. It is a possibility.
Yes,
When you think about fantasy genre, that is unicorns, dragons. That is stuff that,
I see.
though you might believe in the magic of fantasy, it is not necessarily plausible. It's not something that is going to happen or that has
Yeah.
the potential to happen. And so that was the distinction that was made for me, and I loved it, and I kept it with me all this time.
Now, when you were like growing up, were like an avid reader, and was that a category that you gravitated to?
Yes. So when I was growing up, I was introduced to, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Lord of the Rings. As I aged, further, it was Harry Potter. And so, yes, I was deeply immersed in fantasy literature. And of course, I dabbled, just being a reader, you dabble in everything, but that was
Sure.
my main focus. That was kind of like what I was drawn to.
Awesome. Now, where are you from now? What state do you originate from? We always ask that.
Of course, yeah, I'm in New York. I am in
Oh,
actually Westchester, New York. So
so okay. Well, you're in a good spot for writers. That's a very fertile area for writers.
it's so lovely up here. I lived in the Bronx for most of my life in the city, like there was just buildings everywhere and people everywhere. And I kind of traded up for a lot of wild animals in my backyard. And I have
Yes.
I have not looked back. It is very glorious to me. So I like it.
Okay. You don't strike me as the Bronx type. I mean, you seem so pleasant. Nothing against the people in the Bronx. In the Bronx.
Believe it or not, that's not the first time that somebody said that to me. So it's a common thing.
Very good. Okay. Now you basically have three books. All right. So, what are their titles and what do they center around? Let's start easy. That's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have
Hmm?
two books out right now. The third one is still to be released, I'm hoping by early January, fingers crossed. So that one's still kind of in the editing process. But the first one of the trilogy is called The Legendary Guardians Reunions. It is a fantasy romance novel. It is set in a world basically where humans and angels and demons exist under this very fragile peace treaty, held
Hmm.
together by the four horsemen, which when you think four horsemen, you think like apocalypse. But here,
Yes.
They are actually these legendary guardians tasked with protecting humanity from destruction. So, like, if angels decided to rebel, if demons decided to rebel, humans really don't have a leg up in that world. And so, these four guardians are tasked to protect them. However, these four guardians require human vessels. And so one of my main characters, Shade, is forced back into this world that she tried to leave behind when her childhood best friend, Theo, who was selected as one of the vessels, returns after a very long time, about like 10 years. He's the vessel for the Horsemen of Death. He's carrying a ridiculous amount of power, and the whole entirety of book one is him taking her on a journey to reunite the four horsemen, the other three horsemen, to stop this, overall overarching looming threat. And Shade's dog tags along. His name is Mac, because who doesn't really like a dog in a story? um, the second book is called Descent into the Void Heart, which doesn't necessarily make sense if you haven't read the first book, but it is basically the land of demons. It is called the Void Heart. That is their territory. And so it is their continuation after they've all reunited, their journey into these different lands to start forging alliances to battle what they now know as this great looming threat. So it's just a continuation from there.
Okay. Well, that was going to be one of my questions. It sounds to me like they don't stand independently, that you really should read the first one first and then go on to the second.
Absolutely. I would definitely encourage that. You definitely need the context of the first book to roll right into the second one. And then when the third one is released, roll right into the third one.
Okay. I get a lot of people when we have authors on who are really interested in the process. Maybe they're trying to be authors of their own. They're trying to write or what have you. And one of the quotes that I always remember, there's a good friend of mine who's been on a number of different times, and she actually writes a humor column. She's syndicated not know how many papers. And I asked her about writer's block one time, and her answer was, that's a convenience for amateurs. When you're a pro, you can't have writer's block. You have to meet the deadline. And I think that's a common thing that I get from a lot of people is you write, let's say, from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon every single day, whether you are inspired or not. You've got to keep that discipline. How do you manage that? Is that true for you, or do you have another process?
That's really interesting. So I respect that opinion, and I wouldn't even call it writer's block. I am a firm believer that you do need to give your brain a rest.
Mm-hmm.
I am a firm believer that you can stand up and walk away from the story a little bit. I do think, of course, meet your deadlines, 100%,
Obviously,
especially with
sure.
trad publishing. I'm an indie publisher. I've published my own work, so I do not, the deadlines don't really affect me too much, though I can imagine it being slightly different in her situation. Call it whatever you want. At the end of the day, we're all human. Our brains need rests. And so I know when I was writing my books, there were some times where I'd start writing and it was just not what I wanted. And I
Mm-hmm.
and I respected that. I understood that, and I gave myself a little grace to walk away from it for maybe a few hours a day. I'm sure it's different for everybody. But
Sure,
then when
sure.
I would come back to it, I have to say I felt refreshed. I felt like, all right, I took a small break. I can sit down now and I can get to it. But I really want to make it clear from what your good friend has said. She has deadlines. She's probably doing kind of like a trad publishing thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different from me. I do this. This is a passion. This is something that I do on the side of like full-time work, of being a mom, of being a wife, of doing like 500 other things. I don't need to do this to survive.
Yeah.
It's not my main source of income, and so my outlook is very different than others. I want to set that context, because it's different for everybody. But I do believe your brain needs a break, and I will stand by that for everybody.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that's true of a lot of things. Like I do a lot of technical work with media and stuff, and there's times when I get frustrated, and it's just time to walk away from it.
Yeah.
And for some reason, after you take that break, you come back and everything comes together. It's
Exactly.
just Yeah, and I don't know why that is, but it is. You have an
Exactly.
interesting what's the word I'm looking for? A philosophy in how you mold your characters. I found this interesting. Flawed heroes, which implies heroes that not always are great, and relatable villains, which means you don't have like a Norman Bates. You have somebody that's, not so bad. So how does that work for you? How do you twist those together then?
So I love, and I do this with a lot of things, but I love exploring the full spectrum when I can. And so of heroes and of villains and in life in general. But for the sake of my writing, I love exploring that spectrum of heroes and villains. Each character exists somewhere along that range, right? Along that spectrum. And so I choose where they fall based on what best serves the narrative, what best serves the story. In this series, I leaned into the reluctant heroes who didn't ask for this responsibility but stepped up anyway. So the vessels, right? They're not
Hmm.
really given much of a choice. They got to go through these trials. They either become one of the four or they don't, and they go home, and then the cycle renews. They're flawed. They often make ridiculous, morally gray decisions, or choosing a path that challenges the conventional definitions of heroism. Like that
Hmm.
fascinates me, and so that's kind of like what I leaned into. For villains, I embrace the full spectrum here because a lot of what I see are like the gray villains. Like every fantasy I read now is basically the female main character falling for like the villain versus falling for the hero.
Yeah.
And I think that's cool. And I love that. And so I wanted to have like gray villains who could almost be seen as like anti-heroes, sympathetic. You question their actions. They're not really that, cold-blooded. They're almost like redeemable. However, I also do love a good Norman Bates. Like I like a cold-blooded, monster who's just unapologetically evil. And Norman Bates, I'm sure there could be so much dialogue between like, is he truly a monster or is that like a topic on
Yeah.
mental health and stuff like that? So I'll instead of Norman Bates, I'll use like a Sauron type, right, from Lord of the
Mhm.
Rings. Completely just ridiculously evil. He did not need a backstory that was tragic. He just wanted power.
Right.
Power corrupted him, and he just went with it. And so I felt that by like writing these layered characters, I'm aiming to highlight also these like wonderful complexities of what human nature is, right? Like I'm not always good, but I'm not always bad. Sometimes I make decisions that are poor, sometimes I make really wonderful decisions. Same can be said about you. Like it's encouraging readers to reflect on how good and evil aren't always just as like clear cut as, oh my God, this is a Sauron type villain that's just evil and you can't relate versus a do-gooder like a Superman who just no matter what he will always do, what is right.
Yes. Interesting you said that about Norman Bates. There was a TV series that was a prequel to Norman Bates, and they actually portrayed that where he was actually a sympathetic character when he was young.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that's an interesting reason to mention that. You often balance fantastical elements with relatable experiences, and I can tell you as a casual reader, I don't know that fantasy is at the top of my list, but one of the odd dichotomies to it is I'll often hear people say, "Well, it wasn't realistic." Well, it's a fantasy, but there has to be relatability there, right? So how do you navigate that?
Yeah. So they're right. Like, in a broad respect, fantasy is not reality. So it's hard when you're reading about like these worlds that you will never step foot in, right?
Hmm.
However, how I aimed to make it as relatable as possible was with the characters. So, like, admittedly, world building is a challenge for me. It's so usually that's always like a tough question to answer. Like even when I'm describing places like the Void Heart or Arcanadia or the Ethereal Valley,
Hmm.
I focus on trying to anchor these fantastical settings with deeply real character experiences so that the readers can relate in some way to them. So the surroundings may be magical or otherworldly, but the relationships and the emotions between the characters that are in that place remain relatable and grounded. So interestingly enough, like I didn't approach my first draft with like a deliberate connection between like world building and human emotions. Like that, you don't go into it like that. You just kind of go in typing, or at least I do. I'm just like, let me just
Hmm.
get the story out. Um, but during the editing process, I did start to notice like some connections emerge. For example, like the ethereal valley, I describe it as vibrant and colorful. And it's basically created by these gods to entertain humans because that's what gods think of humans, you know, bright distractions. It reveals the gods' inability to truly understand human depth. And so they make these bright, shiny, outwardly appearing things similarly to like I described, like the Sin's mansion as grand and opulent on the surface, but it feels cold and hollow on the inside, kind of like the Sins themselves, lacking that warmth and authenticity. So you find these really cool patterns as you go and as you write that you don't sometimes even mean to do. I did not mean to do those things. It comes out because of that human experience that you and I are so used to living every day. It's normal to us, when you're
Hmm.
incorporating it into fantasy, it's really wild how it comes out sometimes.
Sure. You also talk about vulnerability, and that can mean a lot of things. For example, a vulnerability might be, in a love story, somebody might have a fear of getting hurt. That's one of the more subtle ones, probably one of the more cliche ones. Hitchcock was very famous for taking that to an extreme level. For example, in Vertigo, the hero has not only to confront the villain, but he has to climb stairs, and he's afraid of heights. What do you give your characters in terms of vulnerabilities? Where they is it something where they not only have to confront the villain, but they also have to confront a part of themselves? Is that kind of how you set that up?
Yes, I absolutely did. So, yes, there's a big bad in my story, and it's external, but a lot of the challenges and trials that my characters face um, are internal as well. They're battling some inner demons. And so, I love this question on vulnerability actually, because it is such a core theme of my writing. That dabbles in like mental health and how people handle it. You find like these really intense themes that you at one point didn't mean to put in it, but it just kind of works out that way when you're writing it. Um, so from the beginning, I knew I wanted characters who were strong and powerful, but also deeply human. A lot of the fantasy that I read nowadays, you got the, kick butt MCs. They're just doing it, they're rocking it out, and they are just powerful to the max. And I knew that I did not want that. I wanted the reader to look at these characters and say, okay, I see myself. Like I could do that. I would make
Hmm.
that call. I would make that decision. Or yes, I would run. Like who would want to face something like that? I would turn and flee in the other direction. Um, and so intentionally like moved away from these overused tropes like the constant miscommunication trope or the excessive like dark hero trope. Instead I created characters who like they're not afraid to express their emotions. So whether it's Theo who's confronting his trauma, which is huge, or Shade grappling with like her own fears, or like Wrath embodying her wrath, or Penny just keeping her severe optimism because she's the little bright light of the group. These characters own their feelings and aren't afraid to voice them. And I think that's a superpower in and of itself. And that was something that I was immensely like, I'm going to put this in my story. I don't want characters that are like closed off. I want them relatable. I want them vulnerable, being able to say what they feel and mean it. I thought that was like a really nice, not only twist to the story, but just a really refreshing perspective on like how vulnerability can be handled not only between women either, but with men as well. Like they are just ridiculously open with their feelings, and that's okay.
Yes. You mentioned mental health more than once. Is that a topic that you champion in any way? Or is because like I said, I've noticed you've mentioned it and its portrayal more than once. So I was just kind of what am I picking up there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually did a deep dive into it when I was writing this book. And it happened because, and I always say this, and it sounds so, cliche, but like when you write a story, sometimes you get so immersed in it that you just kind of go where the story tells you to go. Like you're not
Sure.
in charge anymore, right? Like you're just going with the flow. You're like, okay, this took a turn. Where is it going? Let's see. And so one of the characters in the story does face like pretty intense emotional trauma. And I
Hmm.
knew that I needed it in the story. There was no way I was going to write about it without understanding it. I wanted to be ridiculously sensitive to the topic that I was touching on. And so I did a real deep dive and actually spoke to some people who were survivors of this particular trauma. And it was really important to me to get it right, sounds terrible, but to make it as respecting and careful as I possibly could in my approach to it without, I don't want someone to read it and like get triggered. That wasn't my
Yes.
my main thing. I wanted someone to read it and say, okay, like I see it, I see where it's going. So I tried to be pretty gentle with it.
Yeah.
But in doing that deep dive, yes, I became very well acquainted with like a lot of the, mental health, just the community in general. Like I spoke to a lot of people, and they're very open about it,
Yes.
which I thought was a beautiful thing. And then I myself, I am in therapy. And I think that that is a very beautiful uh, thing for me, just because I've seen how much I have grown from doing it, looking back years from when I started to where I am now. And so, huge advocate of it and semi knowledgeable. There's so much out there. So I wouldn't even
Yeah.
say I'm no expert, but I did what I had to do, and I did it for myself and for the story. And so I hope I did it justice.
Well, I can tell that you were very heartfelt about it. I can tell by the way you speak about it. And I think that's very important. We mentioned Norman Bates. Now, I like the psycho movies as much as anybody else. And we all like the psycho craze killer genre. I mean, but by the same token, they don't do the stigma of mental health any good, especially when you consider that someone who's suffering from mental health is far more likely to be a victim of crime than they are to be a perpetrator. And unfortunately, we only hear about the off the wall events on the news. I happen to volunteer a lot, very much involved in the mental health community here in Ohio. And I can tell you that they get taken advantage of by their families, by their friends. They're often victims of crime because they can't defend themselves that well. So it's nice to see another dimension and to hear about a mental health condition portrayed in a heartfelt manner. So I think that's really, really good.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
Absolutely.
okay, sure. Um, I noticed that you speak about, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, the high stakes fantasy can sometimes feel distant. And I think that the term that I've heard when it comes to, fantasy movies or even with science fiction is the suspension of disbelief. I think that's one that I hear a lot. That's kind of maybe applicable. And I've generally found science fiction movies for me, I'll suspend one thing, but not a half a dozen things. Like, for example, Alien. It's very easy to understand. You're on a spaceship, there's a bad alien there.
Yeah.
When you start walking into walls and falling into different dimensions and meeting yourself and all that, okay, now it's too far off the mark. One step, Terminator.
Right.
You got a good one and a bad one. It's very easy to understand. That's here again. That's from my layman's point of view. You don't ask too much of the audience to disbelief.
Yeah.
What's your approach to that?
I mean, I completely understand. I would like to counter that point, though, in saying that if you pick up a fantasy book, fantasy to a lot of people is considered escapism.
Oh, sure.
They're picking up that book because they don't want to read about, a cut and dry, con- I'm trying to think of a good example, but like they don't want to think about something where they can go outside and experience it, right? They want to ride dragons. They want to fight demons. They want to fall in love with, fairies. They want to take a moment to take a break from from the real world, and
Mhm.
done, in a way that isn't, overwhelming, I believe is a wonderful thing. And so when you pick up that book, yeah, you're going to read about dragons. You're going to get on those dragons. You're going to ride the Phoenix in Harry Potter, the dragons in Fourth Wing. You're going to fall in love with, 700-year-old Fey men in Akatar. Like, it's going to happen, and it's not going to happen here. It's going to happen in there, and that's where it's going to stay. And so I'm a big proponent of, as long as you give them something that they can say, oh, okay, like whether it's using your characters and kind of having their point of view be kind of like your point of view, like, oh, I understand why they did that. As long as you have some way to ground them in that fantasy world where they can't only enter unless they open that book, but they can take out with them, and they close the book and they have those feelings still. I mean, I think that's a really beautiful thing.
Sure.
That
You
would be my
you you mentioned a cinematic approach. Do you ever, when you construct these, I'll have you explain that, but with what I hear when I hear that is you envision these stories often as a screenplay. And would you be, of course, every writer, I guess, would want something made into a movie, but do you, when you're writing it, do you kind of feel this would play out a certain way on a screen?
Yes. So cinematic vision has pros and cons to it. And so when I write, I have to see in my head how it's going to play out first. I can't just write something and not have it, living and breathing in my brain. And so I'll kind of do the scene in my head. I'm like, all right. And it plays out kind of like a movie. And I'm like, this is
Mhm.
cool. I'm going to try to do this. And then now my challenge is getting what I just saw on paper. Um, and like I said, it has pros and cons. When it's a pro, it's really great. Like, I'm able to kind of dive into the details. I've seen the pattern. I'm like, yes, I have the dialogue. Everything is flowing. It's almost like I see the writing and I can just type it out now.
Mhm.
Cons to that are screenplays and novels are very different. In a novel, you show more than you tell. In a screenplay, you tell a little bit more than you show because you got to give directions and things like that.
Hmm.
And so, and
Interesting.
I love this question because I love being completely honest. With my first book, it was a learning process. And so you're going to read scenes that do a little bit more of that telling versus showing. Like, even I go back sometimes and I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
because you're just like, I could have probably done that a little better. However, as you continue reading through the book and you get to book two, you learn, like, you see where my growth path is and how I develop on it in book two. And so, like, a lot of showing happened in book two instead of telling. The dialogue flows better. And again, I'm not trying to say book one is lesser than. Book one is my baby. Like, that's where I started everything. It was my learning process. And it's a really beautiful book, but it set the foundation for me to kind of learn and carry into book two, and hopefully book three, what I wanted it to officially be. And then in terms of, do I ever want to see it on the big screen? I mean, yes, of
Of
course.
course.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be awesome. So,
Yes. Well, let's hope Hollywood adopts some new stories because getting back to the psychos, there's only so many superheroes and supervillain movies you can make, and so many car crash movies. Sooner or later, they got to come up with something like what you're doing. So let's hope they
yeah,
do.
please,
Um,
by all means.
I'll wrap this up with something you call creative doubt when it comes to being an author. And here again, a lot of people from the reader aspect are interested in this, but a lot of people that are interested in writing of any kind, I'm sure experience this. Another term that is relatable to like what I do is called imposter syndrome, where you might be talking about something and you're an authority on it, but in the back of your mind, you're saying, "Why are these people listening to me? I don't know anything." How do you overcome that as a writer?
Yes. So that's a really important question that should be like, if I can just give any piece of advice, it would be to, like, in how I'm going to answer this question. Creative doubt is going to always happen, even to like the best of us, right? In the most confident of us. Intrusive thoughts are always trying to creep their way into this person right here. So I combat it with having a solid support system. I'm lucky enough to have one. My
Mhm.
niece in particular, she was the first person that, because, publishing a book and getting it out into the world is quite vulnerable. Um,
Sure.
and so she was the first person that I kind of said, like, here, I'm going to give it to you. I want you to read it and don't make me look like a fool. Like, you tell me your feedback. I need you to tell me, I need you to be honest. Don't let me put it out into the world. If you think that I could do better or if it needs some like type of revisions and things like that. So I was lucky enough to have a support system. I can
Yeah.
say not everybody has that. And so what I want to do is also say that give yourself some credit when you're going through this process. Be gentle with yourself, give yourself some grace. I am usually my own harshest critic anyway. With this trilogy, I allowed myself to be very proud of what I accomplished, and I sat there for a while. Writing a book for me has been like this like lifelong dream of mine. You think about it like what you want to be when you grow up and things like that. And I've always loved writing. And who thought like you could write a book, right? Um, but I didn't just write one. I wrote three of them. And so that's something that I try to keep reminding myself of whenever doubt creeps in. Remember why you started. And it doesn't have to just be like creative doubt doesn't just happen with authors. It happens just
Sure.
throughout with everybody, throughout all of anybody's passions and hobbies. Um, and so just be gentle, give yourself some grace, and be proud of like the milestones you hit. The only advice I would leave them with is like just do it, right? Like just start it, because if you don't start it, then you have no milestones to hit, and you can't say
Yep.
that you at least tried to do it. So you owe it to yourself that if this is a passion, if this is something you want to pursue, even through the intrusive thoughts, even through the imposter syndrome, even through the creative doubt, even if you don't have a support system, you've got to do it. Like even just for yourself, you have to do it and see it done. So.
Great advice. We have been speaking to J.F. Monroe. Where can people find you? What are the names of the books again? And social media, where can people find you?
Yes. So the name of the books, there are two out now. The first one is The Legendary Guardians Reunions, and the second one is Descent into the Void Heart. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok under the same name. It is jf.monroe. I also have a website. It is jfmonroebookshelf.com. There's a blog up there. I tend to update it monthly. And then you can, of course, find the books on Amazon.
Yes, Amazon. The author again, J.F. Monroe. Thank you so much. You're very pleasant to talk to, very engaging and full of helpful information. Thank you so much. It's been a delight having you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Anytime. Welcome back anytime. My name is Billy Dees. You can find me on the platform formerly known as Twitter, which is now X. That's kind of like my social media home. We're on other places too, Facebook and all that. And the Billy Dees Podcast is over 10 years old now in its current form. And we've been on all the major platforms. You can find us anywhere. So if you can't find us, you need to find one of the other internets because we are on all of them. So thank you so much for listening to our program today. And we will talk to you again very, very soon.
Thank you for listening to the Billy Dees Podcast. Follow Billy Dees on X @BillyDees for updates about the program.
Do you listen to music or audiobooks on streaming devices such as Sonos or Amazon speakers? How about on your car sound system? If you use Spotify, Audible, or Amazon Music on any of these systems, you can also listen to the Billy Dees Podcast the same way. Billy and his team go the extra mile to make sure our podcasts sound as good or better than anything on the radio. Listening to the Billy Dees Podcast has never been easier. You literally just have to ask.